India and the United States try to resolve the mess created by the arrest of diplomat Devyani Khobragade, New Delhi is firm in going ahead with its reciprocal steps to hit back at the Americans here. Therefore, sources have told NDTV that with the deadline passing on Monday evening, all ID cards for US consular officers in India have now been withdrawn, which means the immunity of these consular officials will be at par with Indian officials in the US. In Devyani's case, that meant limited diplomatic immunity, do remember that. Also, now family members of US consular officials will no longer get these I-cards here in India. They were getting these until now, whereas the family members of Indian officials in the US were not getting those privileges. Also, so far, US consular staff were allowed to import whatever they needed for their entire 3 years of their tenure here. Now that has been cut down to the first 6 months of that tenure, which sources say is under the Vienna Convention. Sources also clarify that the removal of barricades in front of the US Embassy in Delhi has not affected their security. It is only a change in traffic movement. Well, joining us now here in the studio on Left, Right and Centre is Mr. Prabhu Dayal. He was India's former Consul General in New York, and Mr. Dayal himself was sued by the domestic help who was working for him. That case was eventually settled out of court. And Mr. Dayal, it is your case and the case of another diplomat who was posted in New York, Neena Malhotra, that has been cited by those who have criticized the way India has handled this as saying that these should have been warning signs and that India should have put mechanisms in place to ensure that something like this wouldn't happen. What would you say to that?
Well, first of all, let me mention that the cases against Dr. Neena Malhotra and myself were civil suits. But in this instance, the New York prosecutor's office has initiated criminal proceedings. So the two are somewhat different, although both involve the domestic assistance of Indian diplomats at the Indian consulate in New York. Now, true, there were warning signs after the suit filed by the domestic assistant of Dr. Neena and my own domestic assistant. And the Ministry of External Affairs, I understand, had been working on a system whereby the present arrangement for sending domestic assistance with Indian diplomats to consulates in the United States and also to the embassy would be revamped. And for some time, this idea has been around that the ministry would itself sign the contracts instead of asking the concerned diplomats to do so.
But they clearly didn't step on the gas, because look what happened.
Perhaps if this had been done, yes, this sort of unfortunate situation involving the humiliating arrest and the ordeal which Devyani went through could have been avoided. But let me tell you that by just resolving the domestic assistance issue, we will not be able to fully secure the well-being and the welfare of our diplomats posted in our consulates.
I'll stop you there, sir, because there are those who are critics of the Foreign Service in particular, who say that the Indian IFS feels that it is privileged, that it is more equal than others. That has been that criticism that has been put forward, that this is not just about the interests of our diplomats abroad, which is one part of the story, but also about the interests of domestic helps who are being taken there. And I ask you this because in your case also, the maid who worked with you, Santosh Bhardwaj, she made some pretty serious allegations alleging, as you put it in your article, also slavery, forced labor, non-payment of wages. She also had made a sexual harassment claim. Ultimately, that was altered in the lawsuit. Now, what would you say to the critics who believe that there is a pattern? The problem is the pattern with which we deal with our domestic helps, particularly in our missions.
Well, since you referred to my case, let me mention that my domestic assistant, Mrs. Santosh Bhardwaj, worked for us for 2 years here in Delhi. Then she went with us to Morocco, where she worked for 4 years. She came back to India. We went to New York in September 2008. She voluntarily joined us there in New York in February 2009. Worked with us till January 2010 without any sort of complaint, and then absconded in January 2010. That is 11 months after joining us in New York.
So once she reached New York, it changed?
I don't know whether it changed immediately after her reaching New York, but surely there may have been forces at work. If we had not been subjecting her to involuntary servitude and to slavery in the years that she was with us in Delhi and in Morocco. How come we suddenly became slave drivers or started subjecting her to servitude? You mentioned the charges of sexual harassment and of making her sleep in a storage area. Let me mention that she was given a one-bedroom apartment, fully furnished with attached bathroom in the consulate building, and there were plenty of witnesses to this effect. However, this charge and that relating to sexual harassment
was dropped.
Were voluntarily dropped 6 weeks after they had been made and publicized in the media. So the point I'm making is that in the past, all along, domestic assistants sent with Indian diplomats had been absconding. They had become illegals. There are lots of illegals in the United States. These people stayed on chasing their dollar dreams.
You talked about forces at work. So are those forces at work, you mean those who are the NGOs and immigration lawyers who are looking for these cases, to take in these cases, who then eventually get what they call T visas and then green cards?
There are plenty of other forces at work also. There have been lots of Indian domestic assistants who have absconded, lots of security guards from our embassy and from our consulates who have absconded. They are all staying illegally, and they always play a role in misguiding domestic assistants who are sent from here with diplomats. So there were plenty of forces at work. Now, let me mention that in another case, the one relating to Dr. Neena Malhotra, which we also discussed earlier, her domestic, Shanti Gurung, stayed with her throughout her tenure of 3 years, came to the consulate so many times. I saw her on numerous occasions attending functions at the consulate, such as Republic Day and Independence Day, Diwali, also music concerts. She was perfectly happy. Then on the eve of Dr. Deena's departure from New York, she fled. And a year later, she filed a suit relating to forced labor.
Let me ask you, and again, I'm trying to be the devil's advocate here. Again, the critics are saying that if we know that technically we don't, we are unable to comply with US wage laws because of whatever their system is, should our diplomats be taking domestic helps at all? Should there not be an entertainment allowance, for instance? Is it a necessity? The Indian Express did a story the other day that the Indian taxpayer ended up paying that $75,000 tab to settle your case. How would you respond to that? I mean, should we stop this practice of sending domestic helps to our missions if we know we can't follow the law of the land and that shortcuts have to be taken?
First of all, let me mention that when a lawsuit is settled, the settlement agreement and all aspects relating to it are confidential. So therefore, I cannot speak about the settlement agreement in my case. Let me also mention that the US State Department's website now states that as of March 2012, deductions will not be permissible for accommodation, medical cover and travel, and that from April 2012, deductions will not be permissible for food. So in other words, these deductions were not disallowed earlier. When the government of India sends domestic assistance, it includes their salary and perks in the salary and perks of the officer whom they are accompanying. So if you look at the totality of what the domestic assistant was getting, she was getting a very good furnished apartment with attached bathroom.
My point is,
it's still not electricity, water,
comply with the US law. The point is, it doesn't because Devyani's case, Sangeeta Richard went there in November of 2012, well after the US rules on deduction had come into play. Do you believe, let me sir, ask you finally, that the Indian government has handled this well? It has become a diplomatic mess. It has been played out publicly. But do you believe that the response has been the right response, or that it shouldn't have reached this point of escalation?
I do feel that this matter should have received more serious attention. The matter relating to the overall question of sending domestic assistance, and should have been addressed in such a manner that Devyani's situation would not have arisen. But let me also mention that we do need to address this matter with urgency now, The Vienna Convention, Article 47, states that consular officials will be exempted from local requirements relating to work permits, and their private staff will also be exempted.
Yes, it does say
the
that.
reason for exempting such staff from work permits is so that they don't come under local labor laws. And I think this matter needs to be taken up with the US authorities, along with other issues relating to the diplomatic officials posted at New York, so that arrests and detentions do not happen in future. You would recall that Kritika Biswas,
Yes.
a 12th grade student, daughter of a vice consul, was arrested, handcuffed, kept in detention for 28 hours with prostitutes and drug addicts. We ran from pillar to post to get her released. And finally it was found that the charge for which she was being held, cyberbullying her teacher,
Was done by
was
somebody
actually done by somebody else. So this is horrendous, and I think government has to engage in a very urgent dialogue with the US side to ensure that our diplomats do not have to undergo such situations in future. If at all there's something is found wrong with them, they could be asked to leave the country. Yeah. The Vienna Convention also provides for that.
And at the very least, the US should have informed India about the action that was going to be taken. Mr. Dayal, thank you for coming in tonight and giving us your perspective on this important story as India continues to assert itself on this, hoping that Devyani Khobragade does finally get a new ID card after the Christmas break that would entitle her then to full diplomatic immunity from the day she gets it, and could then possibly lead to her exit from the US. That's it on the show tonight. We'll see you again tomorrow. Goodbye.